Good evening. I'm Kirsten Bridier, the Executive Director of the National Trust for Scotland Foundation USA, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Mo and Show, a musical conversation presented by NTSUSA trustee Dr. Quinn and his husband, Michael Harold, Esquire. As many of you know, Quinn and Michael are not only accomplished professionals, philanthropists, Anglophiles, collectors, and the most wonderful hosts. They are also talented musicians who have performed everywhere from Carnegie Hall to the French Quarter. When they approached me with the idea to perform a brief concert to thank all of the donors who've supported NTSUSA over the past 2 years, I leapt at the chance. But I'll admit, I was a little skeptical that we could find any connections between Mozart, Chopin, and Scotland. Happily, I was wrong. We even found some connections to National Trust for Scotland properties. All roads lead back to Scotland, even the stories of music's masters of the Baroque and Romantic. Our program begins with Michael Harold playing Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 12 in A major from 1782. While Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart never visited the country of Scotland itself, he did meet and play for and with Scots in London and Naples as a young man. Mozart traveled to London with his father Leopold in late 1764 when he was just 8 years old, and he is thought to have met Thomas Alexander Erskine, 6th Earl of Kelly, while there. Though largely forgotten today, the 6th Earl of Kelly was a gifted musician and composer who was responsible for a major shift in musical tastes in mid-18th century Britain. He also was known for leading a lascivious lifestyle, something Mozart too would later become famous for. Thomas Erskine's father, Alexander Erskine, had forfeited his family estates, including Kelly Castle, after siding with Bonnie Prince Charlie in the Jacobite Rising of 1745. And so the 6th Earl was sent abroad to study music in Germany. He returned an accomplished violinist and composer nicknamed Fiddler Tam. In 1765, Thomas Erskine composed the overture to The Maid of the Mill, a comic opera playing at Covent Garden. This was one of the most important shows in town at the height of the social season, and Mozart and his father were certainly in the audience. In addition to the 6th Earl's overture, the program included compositions by Johann Christian Bach, Johann Sebastian's 18th child, and Pergolesi. Another Scot in London at the time of Mozart's visit was William Douglas, Earl of March, later 4th Duke of Queensberry. His nickname was Old Q. Leopold Mozart called him Mr. Milord March in his correspondence. Douglas was known to have a genuine ear for music and often hosted concerts for musicians visiting from abroad at his house in Piccadilly. When in Scotland, he lived at Drumlanrig. A likely guest in his household, and one we know the Mozarts met, was the great castrato singer Tenducci. Tenducci was a friend both of the 6th Earl of Kelly and Johann Christian Bach. He loved performing traditional Scottish songs, and Johann Christian Bach was interested in arranging them. So it's likely that the Mozarts heard work based on traditional Scottish music, as well as music by contemporary Scottish composers like the 6th Earl of Kelly during their stay in London. During the Baroque period, composers learned their craft by copying, borrowing, and experimenting. The 6th Earl of Kelly was a known influence for Johann Christian Bach, who himself was an influence on Mozart. So there is indeed some connection between Mozart's compositions and the Scottish-inflected musical world he experienced as a child in London. And a more tangible connection to Scotland. On May 13, 1765, we know that Mozart played a private concert on a Schutte Broadwood harpsichord. Mr. Schutte was one of 2 great harpsichord makers in London at the time. His assistant, John Broadwood, was a third-generation cabinet maker from East Lothian, who went on to marry the boss's daughter and take over his father-in-law's business. There was a bit of politics to the rivalry between Mr. Schutte and London's other famed harpsichord maker, Jacob Kirkman. The Prince of Wales was a patron of Mr. Schutte's shop and also patron of the music publishing house run by Scottish composer James Oswald. Scots gravitated toward businesses under the prince's patronage rather than those with George II as patron. 5 years later, now all of 13 years old, Mozart met more musical Scots on a trip to Naples with his father. While there, he reconnected with Sir William and Lady Hamilton. Sir William was the British ambassador to Naples. The couple were both musicians and had brought their Schutte Broadwood harpsichord with them to Naples. Lady Hamilton, who was Welsh by birth, played it for the Mozarts on their trip, and Sir William played viola with Mozart father and son at a private concert, as seen in this remarkable painting by Pietro Fabrice, which hangs in the Scottish National Portrait Gallery. The performance was conducted and hosted by Scot Kenneth Mackenzie, later Lord Fortrose, who had rented a house in Naples. Mackenzie was interested in antiquities, literature, painting, and of course, music. He played the harpsichord and was described by 18th century music historian Charles Burney as a lively, sensible, and accomplished young nobleman, in person very manly and pleasing. He has great talents and taste. After bathing, we have an English breakfast at his lordship's, and after breakfast, a delightful little concert, which lasts for an hour and a half. The companion painting shows the other half of the room in Mackenzie's house, and features composer Niccolo Gemelli in mourning over the recent death of his wife, but still finding strength to write music. At this very moment in Scotland, Gemelli's work was being sung by Christian Fullerton, wife of the 6th Earl of Kelly's first cousin, the Honorable Henry Erskine. Her music teacher, Tenducci. All this is to say that the Mozarts were not simply socializing with Scottish aristocrats for financial reasons, though undoubtedly there was some of that, but that this international group came together as genuine lovers of music. One last note. Perhaps the most obvious connection between Mozart, his music, and the country of Scotland is Freemasonry. Freemasonry is rooted in Scottish culture. It was Le Chevalier Andrew Ramsay, a Jacobite Scot who tutored Bonnie Prince Charlie in Rome, who brought Freemasonry to France and from there to Austria. In fact, the 6th Earl of Kelly was the 24th Grand Master Mason of the Grand Lodge of Scotland from 1763 to 1765, just at the time of young Mozart's visit to London. Mozart himself was closely involved with members of a parallel group called the Illuminati, whose ranks included a degree called the Scottish Knight. The Illuminati were closely involved with the Strict Observance Masons, whose order originated in Scotland and whose Grand Masters probably included Bonnie Prince Charlie and Lord Kilmarnock. Mozart's work, most notably his opera The Magic Flute, is filled with allusions to Freemasonry, just one more connection between the composer and Scotland.
Hey everyone, are we on?
We're on.
Hi.
This is Michael Harold. I'm Quinn Pieper. Welcome to our study, where it's a privilege to be here with you all tonight. I hope you enjoy the concert. I want to go ahead and give a few words about Mozart.
I'm going to be the one to start. So Quinn and I had great plans to learn two piano concertos, a Mozart and a Chopin, and we were going to play it in different cities around the United States, and it was going to be a great affair with a lot of audiences. And then COVID hit, a pandemic happened, and we weren't allowed to play for anyone. And so Quinn came up with the idea, after spending about almost a year to 2 years learning these pieces, that we would have a recording made in New York. And we did, and we thought, well, what do we do with the recording? And that's when Quinn said, let's present it for the National Trust of Scotland. So here we are doing it. I have on my laptop here a letter from Mozart. Learning this piece is tough because when you hear Quinn's piece, you know it's 19th century and it's very dramatic and there are a lot of chords and it's brilliant piano playing. And Mozart's work for piano is very simple looking. If you look at the music Mozart wrote, it's very pure, not a lot of notes, not a lot of chords. But what comes with that might look easy, but it's treacherous because every single note, everything you do, every mistake you make is heard.
If I may say, I am much happier playing in the 19th century romantic repertoire because they used a lot more pedaling, whereas the classicist here, the term that the musicians say, you are exposed. So you really better have, it may be one note in this hand, one note in this hand, but they better be perfect.
Yeah, you have to be very vulnerable. So we go to New York to play and I've learned the piece and I have my music ready. And the conductor says, oh no, this is going to be videotaped. You can't have your music. You have to do this from memory. Panic, heart racing. So I'm sure I look on the video, I'm sure I look like a nervous wreck. Hopefully not. I tried to hide it.
Serious.
You can't, I'm very serious. I'm not laughing because it's a lot of work and I'm a nervous wreck, and you can't really hear the heart racing. Kristen just said most everything, but about Mozart's work also, the greatest thing, the genius of Mozart's music is that it's beautiful classical music. It's extremely erudite, yet the melodies he creates are approachable for everyone. You can listen to Mozart and hum the melodies. It's not complicated music. It's simple, yet it's got a richness and layers upon sophistication, which is fascinating. He finished the piece, as Kristen said, in 1782 in Vienna, and he wrote it for full orchestra. And he also, luckily for us, he wrote it for 4 strings, a quartet. And we've been able to play in New Orleans on a pickup truck outside with a piano bolted to a truck with a quartet, which was really fun. What I have, and I found, which I was thrilled to see this, looking at program notes for this piano concerto number 12, Mozart wrote to his father a letter while he was composing it, which I'm so fortunate to have read and I can share with you. He writes, Mon très cher père, in French. I must write to you in greatest haste because it is already 5:30 and I must have asked some people over around 6 o'clock to play a little music. I'm so busy these days that at times I don't even know whether I'm coming or going anymore. The entire morning until 2 o'clock p.m. is taken up with music lessons, and then we eat. After lunch, I have to grant my poor stomach a short hour of digestion, and only the evening is left for composing. I'm writing 2 concertos to complete my subscription concert. He says, these concertos are a happy medium between too heavy and too light. They're brilliant, pleasing to the ear, and natural without being insipid. There are parts here and there from which connoisseurs alone can derive satisfaction, but these passages are also written in such a way that the less learned cannot fail to be pleased, albeit without knowing why. Adieu for now, Papa, and more next time. My sweet little wife and I kiss your hands 1,000 times and embrace our dear sister with all of our heart and remain forever your most obeyed children, Wolfgang Mozart. I hope you enjoy the performance. Thank you.
And now turning to Chopin. Unlike Mozart, Chopin did actually visit Scotland at the invitation of his patron, Jean Wilhelmina Sterling, and at the very end of his life. Jean, who was also known as Jane, can be seen here in a fine portrait by Raeburn that hangs at Fyvie Castle. She was the youngest of 13 children and a pet of her father, John Sterling, Laird of Kippindavie. Orphaned at age 16, Jean went to live with her widowed sister, Catherine Erskine, who seems to have fended off any suitors so that Jean could remain her lifelong companion. Jean and Catherine spent a lot of time in Europe, where they advocated for the Protestant movement, prison reform, and homeopathic medicine. The two met Chopin in Paris in 1840, and Jean, an accomplished pianist, became Chopin's pupil. He said of her, "One day you will play very, very well." High praise. Jean quickly became Chopin's devoted friend and benefactor. In 1844, the composer dedicated 2 nocturnes to her. With a revolution underway in Paris, Jean invited the composer, who was already dying of tuberculosis, to the United Kingdom. He arrived in London in the spring of 1848, where he gave piano lessons to society ladies. While there, he had access to 3 pianos, including a Broadwood. Henry Broadwood, grandson of John, became Chopin's best and truest friend in London. Chopin noticed, "He is, as you know, a very rich and well-educated man. He has splendid connections." And indeed, Broadwood arranged several private concerts for Chopin, including one for the Duchess of Sutherland that had Queen Victoria and Prince Albert in attendance. With the London season ended, in August, the composer took the train to Scotland, where he was warmly welcomed into the homes of Jean Sterling's friends and relatives, at Calder House in West Lothian, Johnston Castle in Renfrewshire, Hamilton Palace in Strathclyde, and Stracher House on Loch Fyne, the home of Lady Murray, his first London pupil. He also stayed at the Edinburgh home of Polish doctor Adam Leszczynski, who gave him homeopathic treatments at Jean's request. At 10 Warriston Crescent, Leszczynski sent his children to be cared for by a neighbor and moved Chopin and his faithful Irish servant Daniel into their nursery. During Chopin's stay, the doctor noticed his hair was curled every day by the servant, and his shirt, boots, and other things were of the neatest. In fact, he was more vain in dress than any woman. But Chopin was gravely ill and unhappy. He needed his servant to carry him up the stairs. He spoke little English, and he was expected to perform at every house he visited. In one letter to a friend describing his stay at Keir House in Perthshire, Chopin wrote, "Everything irritates me, and I continue to gasp until dinner, after which I must remain seated for 2 hours with the men, watching them talking and listening to them drinking. Bored to death, I let my mind wander in between making polite gestures and comments in French." In another, written while he was at Johnston Castle, Chopin complained, "I am cross and depressed, and people bore me with excessive attentions. I can't breathe, I can't work. I feel alone, 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 although I am surrounded. There are a whole lot of ladies, 70 to 80-year-old lords, but no young folk. They are all out shooting. One can't get out of doors because it has been blowing and raining for several days." Even Jean and Catherine were starting to annoy Chopin. "My Scottish ladies give me no peace and come for me to drag me round all the members of their family. I always give in. They will suffocate me with their goodness, but good manners prevent me from declining." In fact, it seemed as though Catherine Erskine was trying to convert Chopin. He wrote, "Mrs. Erskine, who is a very religious Protestant, kind-hearted, may possibly be trying to make me into a Protestant, as she brings me the Bible, talks of the soul, notes down psalms for me." It wasn't all doom and gloom. Chopin gave a concert at Merchants Hall in Glasgow, where his playing was reviewed as an overflowing stream of delicious melody, varied beyond description. And at Keir, a large house party was preparing to attend the Caledonian Rout, a precursor to the Edinburgh Festival. Keir was the home of Sir William Stirling Maxwell, who was writing a book on Spanish painting. National Trust for Scotland aficionados will know that his collection is now on view at Pollock House, and that his son, Sir John Stirling Maxwell, was one of the Trust's founders. Chopin described the preparations as follows. Life in the stately grand homes of people here is truly curious. It is something unknown on the continent. Lady Belhaven is here at the moment, where there are 30 people, very beautiful, very spiritual, very original, very deaf, even an illustrious name, Sir Walpole, blind. Dresses, diamonds, pimples on noses, beautiful hair, marvelous outfits, the beauty of the devil himself, and the devil without the beauty. This last category is the least rare. Everyone is going today to Edinburgh for the Caledonian Rout. All week there will be races, amusements, balls, etc. All the nobility will be there. I look forward to some gossip. Chopin gave a concert as part of the rout at the Hopton Rooms. He played for 2 hours, an extraordinary feat for a dying man. The Scotsman raved about his performance as a refreshing alternative to the Donner und Blitzen school of pianists. But others describe Chopin's playing as beautiful but muted. This was, for all intents and purposes, Chopin's final concert. For after all, his visit to Scotland was Chopin's swan song. He died of tuberculosis less than a year after leaving the country. Though their relationship never progressed beyond friendship, Jean Stirling styled herself as Chopin's widow after his death. She helped pay for a lavish funeral at Paris's Madeleine, where Mozart's Requiem was played. She purchased his effects, including his piano, and sent them to Warsaw to start a museum in his honor. And she wore black for the rest of her life. Chopin had told Jean she was the only one who knew the true date of his birth, and so she wrote it down, placed it in a box, and entombed it with him at Père Lachaise, along with a rose petal from her family home at Kippenross.
Thank you, Kirsten. And I marvel at your wonderful introduction. I mean, that is superb because I've been reading Chopin's letters for a long time, and you really hit the highlights. What I'd like to do is read you some other things that Chopin wrote. Chopin was a man of great genius, but also great contradictions, and his letters are so illuminating. This trip to Scotland that was brought about by Jane Stirling, his patron, was something that she had worked for years. As you could tell, if she's wearing black for the rest of her life after his death, she envisioned herself as more than just a pupil. So the letters are actually pretty funny. Chopin writes on arrival in Scotland, to one friend, he says, I crossed the water without much seasickness. But to another, he says, dear friend, exclamation point, I am here, but I nearly drowned on the way. Another friend, he says, well, at last I'm installed in that abyss that is called London. I am breathing better just these last days, only because the sun has finally shown its face. Chopin had an adversarial relationship with the London Philharmonic. He could not understand why the London Philharmonic wanted him to play, but would allow people to buy a ticket to a rehearsal. And it was all in one day. This was very different from European practice. So here he says, the day after tomorrow, the Duchess of Sutherland is to present me to the Queen, who I will visit for christening. If the Queen and Prince Albert, who know about me, should be pleased, it'll be good, for I'll begin at the top. I've been offered the Philharmonic, but I don't want to play there because it would be with the orchestra. And he talks about how the orchestra likes Mendelssohn. Now, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were German. I mean, Prince Albert was pure German, and through the Hanoverian line, Queen Victoria was more German than she was English. Well, they adored Mendelssohn, and they were maybe suspicious of Chopin, but Chopin didn't make the inroads in the music at the time that Mendelssohn had. And Mendelssohn was very clever because he wrote some duets that Albert and Victoria could play together. But here Chopin gives a hilarious account of the Philharmonic. Imagine if he were a food critic or a travel critic writing. He says, the orchestra is like their roast beef or their turtle soup. Excellent, strong, but nothing more. Later on, he plays at the Duchess of Sutherland's place, Stafford House. He never does get invited to Buckingham Palace. And Chopin was a colossal snob and a dandy. I mean, I still love him, but really, these things matter to him. And the fact that the Queen and Prince Albert never had him at Buckingham Palace, I don't think he ever got over. Here's another letter later in August where Chopin writes about Lady Murray, who was the chatelaine of Strachur House. Strachur House, Michael and I have been to several times. They have a grand dining room with beautiful chinoiserie wallpaper, a bay window, but upstairs they have some beautiful Robert Adam in the library music room bookcases, and they have the piano that Chopin played, and we both played on that piano. So he talks about one of the great ladies here, Lady Murray, one of my 60-year-old London pupils, whose castle I had promised to visit. He does indeed visit. And this is really amusing because I'm in my 60s now, and like Lady Murray, I'm still taking piano lessons, but I probably would not be, Chopin probably would not take me as a student because he really wanted titled aristocrats, and he did charge quite a lot of money. In fact, at one point during his London stay, Lady Rothschild comes up to him and asks him exactly how much his lessons cost, and he's completely undone by this question. But Strachur is a beautiful house, and the Chopin piano is there. Imagine this comment if Chopin is a travel writer. This is to another friend. This is how he describes Scotland. The population here is ugly, but apparently good-natured. On the other hand, the cows are magnificent, but apparently inclined to gore people. The milk, butter, and eggs are irreproachable, and so are their usual companions, the cheeses and the chickens. I think I mentioned to you Queen Victoria never had him. So when Chopin writes to his family, and he's Polish, he's half Polish on his mother's side and half French on his father's. He writes letters back to Poland, and he can be very candid about his experiences, where with other friends he might have to be a little more guarded. So he's writing his family back to Poland, and he says, I should like to describe to you the Duchess of Sutherland's palace, but I can't. All of those who know say the Queen of England has no such house. All the royal palaces and castles are old, splendid, but neither so tasteful or elegant as Stafford House, which is the Duchess of Sutherland's. So, I mean, is that a way maybe of putting down the Queen for not having him call it Buckingham Palace? One had to be careful writing about monarchy back then. Now, I'm sure many of you tonight have been to some Scottish stately homes and gardens, some in England, and you pass hallways and great foyers, great halls, and there are innumerable portraits of people who lived there. And this is a particularly funny quote. Chopin said, if I were in good humor, I would describe to you one Scottish lady, a 13th cousin of Mary Stuart, exclamation points. There's nothing here but cousins of great families and great names that no one on the continent has ever heard of. Conversation is always entirely genealogical. like the Gospels. Who begat whom? And he begat, and he begat, and he begat, and he begat, and so on for 2 or 3 pages till you come to Jesus. I think Kirsten told you about the stately home shooting party routine, which Chopin could not get over. Not speaking the language was a detriment, and having to sit around with men after dinner and their cigars must have been incredibly difficult for a man who's dying of tuberculosis. At one point, Chopin writes a letter about having a carriage wreck, which is humorous. But all in all, I think he really loved Scotland. He described Edinburgh as a splendid city, and on many of the castles that he visited, he could not get over the grounds and how gorgeous they were. He says everything here speaks to the imagination. The park with the secular trees, the precipices, ruins of ancient keeps, endless corridors with countless likenesses of ancestors. They even speak of a certain red-capped ghost who walks about in the corridors at midnight. So clearly he was taken with the Scottish life. And as Kirsten mentioned several times, he talked about Jane Stirling and her sister. My Scotswomen are so kind. They want me to stay. They go on dragging me around the Scottish palaces, here and there and everywhere as I'm invited. They are kind, but so boring that the Lord preserve them. If you ever have time, I would recommend, this is Dover Publishing, has the complete Chopin letters. They're really amusing, but I hope you enjoy the second movement of the Concerto in E minor. Chopin wrote this as actually an adolescent, which blows my mind. Before he left Poland, when he was going to go to Vienna and make a big name for himself in Europe, he wrote 2 concerti, and the first one, it's published as number 1, was actually written second, but this is a second movement that is recorded here of the E minor Concerto. And a lot of people say that a lot of critics and people who just enjoy Chopin's music will tell you that this particular movement is really a nocturne in the style of his later nocturnes that he perfected from the originator of the nocturne, which was John Field in Ireland. So please enjoy the second movement of the E minor Concerto.
It almost makes me forgive Chopin for some of his snarky comments about so we're here live now and going to take some questions and answers from the audience, and I have some questions for you too. And I wanted to start with a compliment from one of the viewers who said, how long have you both been this good at performing such pieces? Can you talk a little bit about your career as musicians, because you have these very accomplished professional lives, but this obviously is a passion and something that you've both worked on for so long.
Well, I think for me, like another hobby I have of needlepoint, it might have been piano and needlepoint are something that's kept me from probably killing some people. So it's kept me from staying out of jail. But honestly, we have in common the fact that both of us started piano relatively late. We were both 8 years old. Michael grew up in New Orleans, and I grew up in Tennessee, in Memphis, Germantown area. So, and it's always, for me, I mean, you answer for you, but for me, it's always been a big outlet. I remember I played at Washington and Lee, for instance, where I went as an undergraduate. I was the accompanist for the Glee Club for 4 years. Then I went to Oxford and in England, and everybody wanted a pianist for string quartets, to cellist. And then when I went to medical school, Columbia had an endowment for theater and music. So I conducted Kiss Me Kate as a second-year medical school student. And then in residency, it was a real balm having a piano because I rented a piano. And, you know, it's residency, a very difficult life. You have odd hours, and when you are off, a lot of people aren't off. So I was able to entertain myself as a pianist. And, you know, there weren't too many complaints from the high-rise building at Cornell where I was a resident. How about you? What would you say?
No, I started at a young age, around 7 or 8, and I started because our neighbor played the piano, and I don't remember this, but my parents and other neighbors said I would sneak under the window when she played and listen to her practice. Loved it. And so my parents said, well, who's her teacher? And she was an Ursuline nun here in New Orleans, and I took from her up through my senior year in high school, and then always continued to play. I didn't major in music or anything. It was strictly just a fun hobby on the side, and I've always played. It's just always been therapeutic for me.
And are there other composers that you love to play beyond Chopin and Mozart?
Oh, yes, yes, yes. Before Mo and Show, which is the Chopin and Mozart, we were rock and Bach with the Louisiana Philharmonic. So Michael played Bach and I played Rachmaninoff, Piano Concerto No. 2. You were Bach No. 5. And that was fabulous. That was one of the greatest experiences. You tell about it because you tell about it so well.
Well, no, it was wonderful. It was for another charity. We didn't want to play for anyone. We didn't want to make money. We wanted to raise money for somebody else. I was too embarrassed. I'm too much of an amateur to play for somebody to pay me for it. But we worked hard. We had teachers and lessons for a year and a half, and it was wonderful. Just like this, we spent a lot of time learning and taking lessons from various professors and teachers. Each part of that piece, every little phrase, every nuance, every note was taught by somebody. You know, Mozart wrote it, but then you always need a teacher to tell you how to interpret it and what finger to use. It's really good. It's nice to get lessons. It's always good. I love them.
Can you tell me a little bit about the process that you went through to film these? Because as you mentioned, you had a different plan for this program and COVID came along. I think for us, it's one of these wonderful COVID silver linings because now we get to share your talents with such a larger audience than we would normally. And I think another silver lining was the musicians that you were able to work with in New York. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the musicians were very appreciative having the opportunity to work. Many were furloughed. A lot of the musicians were members of the orchestra, the Metropolitan Opera, the New York Philharmonic, Broadway, and unfortunately they were furloughed, and so they missed the opportunity to come together. Chamber music is about coming together. A symphony is playing together. And, you know, Zooming doesn't just go so well with musicians who like to be together. So much depends on being with your neighbor and in your section. And so much of performing is in the moment, if you will. And so they really appreciated the ability to come together because we wanted to make this recording. It was made in Lincoln Center at the Church of the Good Shepherd, which has great acoustics and a marvelous Steinway. And the Stephen Ray artists, they are our coaches in New York for when we do these big programs like Rock and Bach and Mo and Show. And they put the players together. They're very plugged into the musical community there. They were fantastic.
What are you working on next?
We don't know. I'm learning Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata.
Okay.
And a Brahms piece, so it's kind of fun to change the composer a little bit. It's going to take me another year or two to learn that also, but it's fun.
I also recorded Rhapsody in Blue with another orchestra. That's an interesting recording because that happened during COVID, and at that point in COVID, we are all masked. That was before vaccinations, and the New York City music union had really strict regulations about musicians meeting. Musicians usually share a stand, and at this point, string players had to be 6 feet apart, and horns, obviously you can't mask and play woodwinds and horns and brass. They had to be 9 feet apart. So for Rhapsody in Blue, the situation was really different, but I think it was a successful recording, and I'm going to play Rhapsody in Blue with the Louisiana Philharmonic this April, I think,
Oh, great.
for a Park Live in the Park concert here in New Orleans. And then I'm working on more Rachmaninoff because I think people want Rock and Bach back.
Well, it sounds great. We had a comment from the audience. Someone says, "Do more Bach." So you have someone pulling
right,
for
I
the
love
Rock and Bach show, Michael.
Okay, Bach's one of my favorite composers to play. I love it. So good. I'm glad that there's another Bach fan out there.
He does
Great.
exceptionally well with Bach. I'm a
I
wreck
enjoy it.
playing Bach, but I like Rachmaninoff. So
So you guys really have very complementary skill sets and composers that, you know, you're not in competition with each other. You like
No,
different
no.
things.
No, well, Bach couldn't appreciate Rachmaninoff, but Rachmaninoff and Chopin love Bach and
Right.
Mozart. So it's kind of, I'm playing the early ones, he's playing the later ones.
Yeah. I have
It's
to
funny
ask
right now.
because, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was gonna say, we're sitting in our library and I have on long underwear. It is about 41 or 40 degrees in New Orleans. And we're in these houses
TMI.
here. These houses in the deep south along the Gulf Coast are built for the heat of the summer. It starts getting into the 80s in April and it stays in the 80s until November, and 80s and 90s. And right now it's freezing cold and it's like an old Scottish house. It's really pretty cool. We're in this room filled with thick walls, and it's nice.
Only we don't have a fire because some moron who owned the house, this house is from 1860s, decided to brick up this fireplace. So I mean, to make this fire operable, we would probably have to tear this room down, and we're not doing that.
Chopin probably was in drafty houses in Scotland, and we are in one right now too, because it's not insulated. It's
Very
cold.
atmospheric.
Yes, very.
So I have to ask, after doing all this research and learning about Broadwood harpsichords and pianos, have you ever played on harpsichords or have you always played on pianos?
I played on one. Mm-hmm.
Did you?
Yeah, I played on one too.
Are they really different?
Yeah, I don't like it.
Oh yeah, vastly different. Yeah, the pianos were also different back then as they are today. I mean, there are recordings available of pianists today who will play on a 19th century instrument, and you might not like the sound because your ear is used to current 20th century instrument and 21st now century instruments. So they're very different sounds.
Well, thank you again so much for doing this. We had a question from the audience asking if this would be shared. And yes, we've recorded this program. We're going to share it with everyone who is here tonight and also with the gala attendees who could not join us tonight. But thank you, Michael, and thank you, Quinn, for sharing your remarkable talents with us. This was such a fun project for me because I learned a whole new side to Scottish history that I had never even imagined.
Your notes and your narration were perfect.
I mean, fantastic.
Yeah, in Scotland, I mean, I think Chopin in Scotland could be a Netflix series. I mean, it could be
Absolutely.
a great. But
He's
I mean,
such a
so
character.
much that I didn't read, and I mean, it's very fertile for future. So
we'll have to get you to 5e Castle to play there where Jane Stirling's portrait is.
I'm free that weekend. I love that castle.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Quinn. We'll see you soon. Good night, everyone.
Bye.